Hello everyone, welcome back. In last lesson we have added functionality for a new account, right? And when we create a new account and can receive email and register email address. And we haven't tested for some other scenarios like duplicate name or duplicate email address, but I think it does exist. Say for example we have name J, which already exists for username, and say type in random email address, create a new account. Username already exists, choose a different one. Okay. What about the email? Let's see. This email should exist. Email already exists, choose a different one. Okay, so that works, which is good. Now in this lesson, we're gonna add the forget password part. This should be similar to our new account. It's just you're gonna fetch an email, get a temporary password, and you're gonna update it with new password. And that's it. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that. So we're gonna open our user resource again, and let's copy and paste the code for new user, and I'm gonna paste it. This one would be a different mapping, which is forget password. Okay. And as we only have one parameter, which is the email, we don't have a list of elements, so we don't need to use the mapper. Instead, we can just simply convert that into a string of email, and that should do the trick. We don't need validation check for that, but we do need the user service to retrieve the user by email. And this, well, actually, if the user not equal to now, we're gonna say email not found. Sorry, this should be equals to now. And then we're gonna do a new password. Okay. And we don't need to change the role or create a user, we just need a new password, okay? And we're gonna need to use the new variable name or new email here. I just changed the variable name, whatever that you like is fine. We're gonna construct that password, new password we have here, and the user, and we're gonna send it into the email. Here we're gonna say email sent. Okay. So let's come back to our, let's see, my account component. We have our forget password, right? Yeah, that's right here. So this one should be equal to email space send pound sign. Is it pound sign here? Let's see. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that the string here is the same as the string. And then we're gonna modify the forget password email send, email not exist. This one to replace the value here. Okay. And sorry, not email sent. This is a mistake. It should be email not found. Okay. So let's see. Suppose I'm a person and I forget an email. And I'm gonna type in my email address. Submit. no message available. User password. Oh, that's because we haven't restarted the application yet. Let's do that. Okay, application started. Let's try it again. Email doesn't exist. Alright, that doesn't look good. Let's see. Email doesn't exist. So this color of alert doesn't look correct. Let's quickly fix that. So when we are trying to alert someone, it should be alert warning, not success. Well, this is success, this is warning. And then, let's see. Let's try to do it again. This time I'm gonna record the data book, okay? Email doesn't exist. Why this warning doesn't work? Warning. Okay, there we go. Email doesn't exist. And we're gonna look at a transaction here. We have pre-flight, which is good, and we have the red one, which has an error for 100. Basically means there's some error going on, and we can see there's a request to payload, and we have the email as this one, which is correct. And then come back to our. So we're gonna do some debugging. Let's put some stop point here, and we're gonna stop the application and start it with debug. So the application has started, and just a quick trick, if you want to add a stop point, you just double click on the line, alright? And then you can add it, and then you can, delete it, add it. And let's just run, well, not run, but just do it again, send the request. And yes, we're gonna use a different perspective to look at debugging mode. And here we don't have any variable yet, but let's see. We're gonna just do a step over, go to the next line, and then we have the email address, which is, that's right, ray.den83@hotmail.com. So we have the email address captured. And how about a user? Do you have a user? So we have now user. So that is to say the find by email is not working correctly because we have the correct email, which is here, but we are not getting the user. Okay, so let's see what's really happening. Come back to the Java perspective, and let's see. That's under the server's user service implementation. We have find by email, right? User repository find by email. That's correct. Let's go to repository. We have user repository find by email, string email. And let's take a look at our domain model. We have the user, and we have email as well. So this is kind of interesting that we are not getting any, anything on our user. So this user service defined by email has some problem. And if you actually recall that when we're trying to check whether this one works or not, it looks like it finds the duplicate email successfully. So that is to say, we have our user service defined by user email that's working for this one, but not working for this forget password. So there must be something different within the two contexts. And if you further notice that, you will see this one we are using as mapper, right? But this one we are using as a direct email, and we do see that we have the email here, but this is an object, or it's an instance rather than a string. You see that? You have email, column, and ray.den83@hotmail.com. So that's an object, not as primitive type string. And then if we want to confirm on that, we can simply just come back, edit the line, and print out email. This is a trick that you can use a lot of times. And you're gonna restart service. And then if we do a resubmit, we can say the printout result is an object. So what we can do is we're gonna use get item email, and then you just notice that this get item doesn't really exist on this. Why is that? Well, that's because this is something that is very tricky. Remember that in Java, by default, if you have a toString method, basically when you print out, that toString method is called, right? And when you call something that is an object or reference, it doesn't display the content of that reference. It displays the address, the memory address, unless you override the toString method, okay? But this one, when you're trying to print out email, it directly shows up like this. What does that mean? That basically means this entire thing is a string, okay? This entire thing is a string. You see that? That's why we can't get item on this. But if you call some method from string, say char add, something like that, that works because it's string. Okay, so the way to fix that, we can do something like similar to what we have done before. We're gonna do a hash map. Okay, like that. And then we're gonna just retrieve get item email. Sorry, not get item, but get. But you got the point. So in this case, let's rerun. And we can disable the breakpoint. Okay. And we're gonna restart the application. Alright, so the application has been restarted, and let's do it again. So submit. Alright, we have no response, but let's take a look at our developer log on the network. So the last two transactions should be the one, and we have a post, and email sent. We do get email sent. And if we go take a look at our and we do get our new password, okay, here. So if we sign in with this new password, we should be able to do it. Okay, looks like something is wrong. So let's try the password again. For our email. And try to log in. Okay, we still can't log in. What about the previous email? The previous email, see if we can log in with the previous password. We can use previous password. So the password hasn't been updated, even though we received a new password. Let's examine the code and see what's going on. So we have the password and generate it, and then we encrypt it, and we set the user password. Okay, I see. So we set the user password, we change it, but we haven't saved it. So what we need to do is we're gonna call the user service dot save user. Okay, so we need to persist that information into our database. So this is something very usually happen. Whenever you're trying to modify something, in order to make it effective, you have to save the change to database. Okay, otherwise it's just stored in the memory, but it's not persisted into our database. So this is something should be careful with. And then let's rerun the application. Okay, started, and then let's see whether we can retrieve the password and update it. My account, go to the email, and let's try to fix the problem of the email sent. Why doesn't it show up? So this should be email not exist, and then there'll be forget password email sent. In the my account component, we have the forget password email sent. So whenever we have a user service, okay, so this one should be forget password email sent. Okay, let's come back to our homepage and try to do it. Okay, email sent. So this is good. Let's come back to our Hotmail, and we have our new password here. And let's try to log in. There we go. So this forget password now is working. That's good. All right, that's pretty much for this lesson. We will continue in the next one.